All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome and thank you for taking the time to be with us. I am very pleased to introduce to you for this afternoon's program our speaker, Victoria Machado. Victoria received her BA and her MA at the University of Florida, focusing on intentional communities, sustainability, and bioregionalism. After working as an environmental organizer in South Florida, she returned to UF, where she is currently a PhD candidate studying the intersection of religion and environmental activism. So more specifically, she's interested in state and local water issues, environmental justice, and the underlying values that promote social change. Victoria's topic this afternoon is sacred waters, exploring the protection of Florida's fluid landscapes. So please join me in welcoming Victoria Machado. Welcome, Victoria.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. And I realize that my bio has had a few more updates since then. I finished my PhD several years ago at UF, and I am now a visiting assistant professor here at Rollins College in the Environmental Studies department. But I am very grateful to the Marco Island Historical Society, and I'd like to give a special thank you to April for connecting with me and organizing this event. Today, this presentation was funded by the Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State, the Division of Arts and Culture, and the Council on Arts and Culture. And so today we are going to be talking about spirituality and Florida's sacred waters. So we will talk about what this means in the context of environmental protection. And I am going to share with you a few stories about water. And more importantly, they are stories about our connection to water and how we might reimagine this resource by looking at it within the lens of the sacred. And I want to talk a bit about where I'm coming from, and more specifically, my academic background and the framework in which I conduct my research. I also want to talk a little bit about how we can view water as sacred space, and more importantly, how we can re-examine current efforts to protect Florida's waters, particularly when we are thinking about climate change. So I am an academic. I am not a storyteller, but as someone who studies the humanities and as a scholar who is very passionate about public engagement, I'm learning to become a better storyteller. So to give you some context, my PhD is in religious studies, and I studied at a secular university. So for 17 years, I have focused on understanding the beliefs and practices that we all love and sometimes love to hate so much. So like politics, religion is a contested topic. And my studies have largely been focused on sociocultural perspectives. So while I have taught traditional world religions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hindu traditions, my specialized subfield is in religion and nature. And I currently teach in an environmental studies department focusing on the environmental humanities. So I teach courses like environmental literature, environmental history, nature writing, and one of my favorites is nature spirituality. Am I still coming through okay? There's like a slight lag on my video, and I wasn't sure if I am still, if you can hear me all right.
Well, I can hear you perfectly. If anyone does have a problem hearing, if you could just put a note into the chat, that would be great. So the image that I'm looking at, Victoria, is the feather and religion and nature.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. um, so like I said, today we are going to be talking about the spiritual within the environment. And in some case, this means viewing the environment as inherently sacred. And in other cases, it means viewing the environment as if it were sacred, or shifting our perspectives to further highlight the importance of our environment. So religion and nature covers a range of topics. And when I ask my students what words or phrases come to mind when I say nature spirituality, they usually give me the following. And I think it's kind of telling. It's really fascinating to hear like what students are bringing each semester. But oftentimes there's this concept of connection. Um, and there are several scholars who have successfully grounded this idea. Some early scholarship in religion and nature recognizes the complexity of this area of study. So Catherine Albanese has characterized it as everything from cosmic environmentalism to the truly real to the emblem of a higher spirit. And she recognizes the different variations and histories, and she ultimately settles on nature religion as this symbolic center and cluster of beliefs, behaviors, and values around it. And so to put this simply, Braun Taylor, another religion scholar, calls it an expression for all religious phenomena in which nature is an important religious symbol or conceptual resource, whether or not nature is considered sacred. So I want us to think about this definition, and more so, I want us to think about what arises when we put our beliefs into practice. And the one thing that I want us to keep in mind for this talk is that we all have underlying beliefs, behaviors, and values. And some of these they shape the stories that we tell and the ways we interact in this world. So we have collectively held beliefs, behaviors, and values that are reinforced through our communities and our society. These are things that we can agree on. And we have attributed certain signs and symbols to specific meanings. These are views that we share. There are also symbols that are contested, and they provide very mixed reactions and responses. So for a Gator fan like myself, right? FSU and UF is very contested, but as are politics. So stopping to relax or take caution when you're wading into uncertain waters is kind of how I see things. And so for today, I'd like for us to think about how our environment shapes us and how nature can be an important religious symbol or conceptual resource within our stories and beliefs. So I want to start with a question for the audience. And I want to start with this question: what is the sacred? What is sacred to you? And how do you understand the sacred? So right now, I'm not sure if I can see the chat, but nothing has been entered into the chat. So hopefully if you can enter something in there, that would be great. And maybe I can see it. And if not, we will figure it out. So feel free to put any kind of responses in the chat as to what is the sacred. Life, thank you. Yes. Okay, spiritual. Yeah. Maybe a couple more. We'll we'll stick with these for now. Okay, there we go. Water. um, Water set aside for God, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Susan, Camilla, for Pat, for weighing in here, right? So these ideas of, life and spiritual and water and something that is maybe set aside for God, right? The challenge with understanding the sacred on an individual level is that it's difficult to organize it in a way to collectively understand the implications or what repercussions come from these meanings or feelings. But if we can collect these understandings as we would any kind of data, then we might be able to make sense of them in a broader way. And this is just what early scholars of religion did. And so I think that like life and spiritual and water and you know that is what is set aside for God, those like we're moving in that direction, but then trying to figure out like what can we ground that in, you know, what specific things are the sacred. That's where things get a little bit more tricky, right? So Machado Eliada, he was a philosopher and historian of religion at the University of Chicago, explored religious experience, myth, and meaning making. And he understood the sacred in terms of a duality. The sacred is that which is set apart from the profane. And so the profane is often seen as the everyday. It is that which is outside of the sacred, sometimes in very distinct ways. So a building or a monastery or a temple or a mountain, sacred events occur in sacred spaces. So if you're familiar with Judaism or Christianity and the Old Testament, these are spaces where the sacred can be experienced, often by people of elite standing. So we're thinking like family lineages and priestly orders. So temples were built with a certain space containing the Holy of Holies, and certain people were allowed in these spaces. And they often had to prepare themselves for this connection with the divine through various rites, rituals, and protocols. And today, people still take care when entering sacred spaces. But in many respects, it's not so black and white. So, and it wasn't really so black and white back then either, in terms of sacred and profane. If you recall, God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, right? So, like the idea of the sacred being entirely separate from the everyday is something that has been contested. And such divisions and categories of the sacred and the profane do not account for largely non-Western traditions that view the earth as inherently sacred. So, though such viewpoints originated in other cultures, the concept of the earth as a sacred being or a place that is worthy of reverence has woven itself into American environmental thought. And we see this in our interactions as environmentalists fight for conservation, preservation, and protection, and we pass this down in our histories. It is one of the reasons why I teach the writings of John Muir and Rachel Carson in class, because these individuals have made sense of the world around us in ways that penetrate not just our minds, but our souls. So they, along with others like Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Aldo Leopold, they have laid the foundation for us to see the American landscape as special, as worth more than something that such as economics or capital. It's interesting because I talk to my students about this. There is a really famous John Gast image called American Progress, that is really depicting westward expansion in many respects, and also manifests destiny in a lot of respects. And so my students we will often talk about this idea of, you know, how is it that we have kind of moved from this idea of domination into this idea of preservation and conservation, and we need to care for the earth. And so this seems like a lot, so you don't have to read all of it, but I will summarize it here. The same can be said for people like William Bartram and the romantic imagery that he used to describe the springs here in Florida. And like I said before, you know, not too long ago, public opinion did not see the American landscape as one worth saving. And so that is something to keep in mind, that, you know, this shift from understanding it as capital, as economic, to understanding it in a way of in it preserving it for its inherent value, that is a shift, and we're still making that shift, right? We still see the land in many respects as capital and economics, but to move in the direction of recognizing its inherent worth, that is something that I think, it's more recent. So kind of getting back to this, when we see water as a holy agent or a sacred item, our interaction with it changes. For instance, prior to the creation of baptismal fonts within churches, and still to this day as a way of baptizing large numbers of people, Florida's water has been and continues to be seen and used as a rite of passage. So this image was taken in the 1950s at a place called Paradise Park. And this was the only Springs tourist attraction that people of color had access to in the times of segregation. And so it was located down the river from Silver Springs, and this space was transformed from a place of recreation and play to a place of holiness and renewal, especially on Sunday mornings when churches would come out and hold baptisms in the water. And what I really love about this example is how this space transforms for those who are present. So they shift their mentalities from play and pleasure to reverence and respect. And the water facilitates this transformation of thought, but it's not just a transformation of thought. It's also a transformation of action. So if you notice the attire of the people in this image, many of the onlookers are wearing their Sunday best, and those waiting to be dipped in the water are dressed in white. So we can only imagine what the conversations might be like on shore. And I suspect that people may have a certain reverence and respect for the ritual taking place before them. And this isn't the first time that Floridians have considered water as a sacred conduit. This is an artist's rendition of the bodies that were found in Titusville, Florida in the 1980s. And developers found these bodies. It was specifically in 1982 when they were breaking ground on a new housing development. And the fascinating part is that they are estimated to be 7,000 years old. And the bodies, there were 168 bodies in total that were found. 91 still had their brains intact, and that was because it was preserved in this peat bog. So many of these people lived into their 70s. Some of them still had food in their stomachs, so we could tell what was going on in terms of their last meals. This was a huge find for archaeologists, but for religion scholars like myself, it's of particular importance because the bodies were positioned in similar ways with their heads deferred down toward the setting sun. So this was a very intentional way of burying people, and they were buried in the water. So there is something to, as a religion scholar, I can kind of start thinking like, well, what is it, the connection to the water that early people may have had that they decided to bury their loved ones here? Did it represent some kind of outlet or some kind of connection to an afterlife? And all these other questions come up in terms of, how did they think about this particular space? How was it considered? How did people act in this space? And did they treat this body of water differently than, say, other ponds in the area? And as a kind of side note that connects to this is that since this time in 2016, archaeologists have found other bodies that were buried in similar ponds, this time on the Gulf. And that was 2016 when they found another water burial from around a similar time period. So there is something to be said about how water is infiltrating the lives of Floridians, not just today, but of the past as well. And so just as the water at Paradise Park changed from a baptismal font to a place of recreation, or the bog from a pond to a burial site, the histories accompanying our locations show that places can change given a mindset. And in turn, actions can change too. So this is an image from St. Augustine in June of 1964, when James Brock dumped acid into the pool to disrupt swimmers protesting the hotel's whites-only policy. So once segregated beaches and pools, locations of contestation, have now been reinterpreted to become places of inclusivity. In other words, the thoughts that we bring to spaces do in fact have an impact on how we interact with these places, who has access to these places, what activities are permissible, and how people change the narratives and change their actions. So time, different social orders, different events, people, and communities have led to the sacred as being ritualized, reinterpreted, and contested. So these spaces are dynamic and fluid and complex, according to other religious theorists such as Thomas Tweed. So for example, the recent discovery of a Tequesta settlement on the Miami River forces us to reconsider, is the land that we are building on indeed fit for construction? Or could this be a sacred site? And furthermore, if it is a sacred site, what responsibility do we have to protect, honor, or care for such spaces? So what I'm asking here is, can we view our water bodies as sacred spaces, especially when considering that we are consumers of water and we are polluters of water? And when our water is our place of refuge in an ever-increasing climate, I would argue, yes, that we can view it as sacred. And in some cases, we already have. So similar to Paradise Park and Silver Springs and Windover Pond, we create spaces every day because we are meaning-making individuals. And this includes water spaces. As we continue to live on a warming planet, our narratives will continue to shift, and water as a respite, a refuge, and maybe even a sacred space may further enter our conversations. In addition to writers like Bartram, and see, this is kind of as a side note, this is one of the things that we see as we are looking at different spaces. And I think that's a really great point, Susan, that we didn't let them build on the footprint of the Twin Towers. That's a really excellent example that, again, we are meaning-making individuals. And we take places out and we say, you know, this is permissible and this is not permissible, right? This is allowed and this is not allowed, right? And various religions also have that element of what is allowed and what is not allowed. So thinking about kind of getting back to writers like Bartram, right? Locally, others have laid the foundation for Florida's sacred waters, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas helped turn a once thought to be useless swamp into a gently flowing river of grass. So these are some images by some of my favorite photographers. This one is by John Bob Carlos, and who is a Everglades photographer. And what I really appreciate and love about these images is that they capture the beauty of these spaces. And again, like I had mentioned, it was not very long ago that these spaces were seen as useless landscapes, right? And it was mostly because they were not seen as productive or economically viable, or they were difficult for, or harsh environments for people just couldn't live, right? So artists and photographers have found deep meaning in our waters. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called our springs liquid bowls, or bowls of liquid light. And they are these places of refuge. And the same can be said of our rivers and some of our lakes, right? We'll talk about Lake Okeechobee in a moment because of all of issues of pollution and whatnot. But when a region is threatened, say by a pipeline, environmentalists are not willing to stand by the sidelines. This happened in 2016 when there was a pipeline proposed to go through Springs Country. And this is a region of Florida with hundreds of freshwater springs. In Florida, we have over 1,000 springs, which are directly connected to our aquifer, which is where we get our water. So according to the United States Geological Survey, the Floridan aquifer encompasses 100,000 square miles, and this is thought to be one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world. And it extends into southern Alabama, southeastern Georgia, southern South Carolina, and some of Mississippi, while also covering all of Florida. And so like the idea of a pipeline compromising this water in any way, it created a wave of protests. Similar, if anyone is familiar with various other environmental movements, this was similar to Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline. It also is occurring around the same time. So environmentalists were advocating for water's protection, and the sacred was created, it was produced. And so the thought of compromising this water in any way, so community established this ritualization by drawing on deep-seated notions of these spaces as set apart. Language was used to speak for the water, and again, to craft a deeper story about how important its protection is. And then finally, contestation, similar to the Tequesta site, was enacted through direct protest of the pipeline. So there were people who wanted the pipeline and there were people who did not. But regardless, the sacred emerged through this storyline. This is a storyline that FAU sociologist Patricia Widener would call a narrative of resistance. And we see this in other actions as well. And most notably, we see this in something called sacred water ceremonies, which take place on the east and west coasts of Florida. And collectives of people have been hosting these in the form of prayer walks in the Everglades around Lake Okeechobee, and also in North Florida on the St. Johns River and around Springs Country. So what happens when we listen to the spiritual motivations of environmentalists who love and advocate for these water bodies? And I'm asking, can stories help us to revise our interactions with water? Can the creation of the sacred protect the physical environment? Or can identifying water's potentially inherent sacredness change how we interact with it, especially as we are facing rising temperatures and climate change? And so will water bodies become beacons of hope in a seemingly hopeless world? So I'm going to walk you through some of the ceremonies that I have attended when I was researching the narratives associated with Florida's environmental movement. And this was a ceremony that was held in High Springs. It was an intimate ceremony of a little less than a dozen people, and I chose to focus on the space that was created. So in the next few slides, we're going to look at the space, and I want us to analyze what's going on here and how meaning is being created, and then what does this mean? So when we are thinking about this, what are some of the things that we see here on this particular table, right? Well, number one is that we see these vessels of water. And so it turns out that people were asked to bring water from their particular spaces. So one woman brought water that was from the Gulf of Mexico prior to the Gulf oil spill. And for her, this was very important because the Gulf oil spill was a real big game changer, not necessarily just in how she approached the water, but it was also a game changer in terms of livelihoods and what was going on in her particular area. Some other water that we have here, another person brought water from their tap, right? Recognizing like that again, we're creating the sacred, taking something from the tap where we may normally cook or drink with it and bringing it to a sacred water ceremony. And then we have this Florida water kind of coming out of a more touristy fountain of youth, right? So other icons were found on this table, some of them being various deities, the goddess Pachamama, who is this smaller down here holding the world in her womb, and then green Terra, who is in the center. So these also made an appearance on this table. And as were a handful of stones and crystal-like objects. So this space was very much intentionally created. It was held near a rock shop that had a labyrinth in the back. And if you have ever walked a labyrinth, it is one way in, one way out. It is not, it's not a maze. It is a path that is supposed to represent a spiritual journey. Oftentimes when people come into a labyrinth, they hold an item with them. So maybe it's a stone or a shell or some other kind of item that they are going to put in the center. So the concept of a labyrinth within, at least within various traditions, is you can kind of see it as you are walking toward your intention as you are getting deeper and deeper into this spiral. Some people will say you are entering into this space, and sometimes it feels like you are moving toward your intention. Sometimes it feels like you're moving away from it because it's similar to a maze, but no dead ends. And sometimes you are walking alongside it. You can also see this within the context of maybe a higher being, like you are moving toward God, walking alongside. Sometimes it feels like you're moving away. But the concept here is that you are getting closer and closer to the center. However you may feel in this space, you are actually getting closer to the center. And so participants enter these spaces with with intentionality and mindfulness. And this is, again, part of the concept of creating the sacred. We make space for that which is important. And for them, they were gathering here to honor the water. And so I have one more example of a sacred water ceremony. And for this one, I'd like to take you back to 2016 when South Florida experienced a series of extensive toxic algal blooms. And this wreaked havoc on the waterways, severely damaging local livelihoods that relied heavily on the water. So known as blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria outbreak caused lakes and canals to turn a slime green, and it was accompanied by this overbearing stench. So these blooms nearly covered Lake Okeechobee, and with it came marine and fish kills on both coasts. And it was so bad that state officials declared 2 state of emergencies, one in the summer of 2016, another in 2018. And this was agitated by high nutrients from industry and agriculture, storm runoff, septic tanks, rampant development. So, us, the humans who depend on this water, we caused the problem, and we were also severely impacted by this issue because at the time, tourists and visitors kept their distance, and this caused businesses to really feel the brunt of the impact. So the sludge that brutally damaged local economies also presented a slew of respiratory problems for those living near the water. And it caused Floridians to realize just how interconnected we are with the natural world. And during these cyanobacteria outbreaks, environmentalists were faced with the task of making sense of this problem in the midst of their work. And they had to figure out how to take action to clean up the state's most vital resource. And so while many turned to petitions and protests, a handful of individuals turned to prayer. And one such collective began approaching the problem publicly through prayer, ritual, and mindfulness. So they began several years prior to the 2016 outbreaks, and they recognized the importance of water, hosting monthly sacred water ceremonies. And these consisted of rituals on beaches and banks of rivers. So they held these rituals in proximity to other water bodies, and they hoped to raise awareness about the sacredness of water while further connecting to the water through positive energy forces in order to promote healing efforts. And so the group drew from the power of thoughts and actions to support restoration of the water. Much of this is rooted in the power of consciousness, and they professed the significance of words in experiments with water, stating that waters can physically change based on the positive or negative music or words spoken to them. So sending negative energy causes the water to harmfully change. Sending positive thoughts and compassionate prayers helps to promote clean water. And now this is the controversial part, but this is where I think it's really interesting, because even though we can always say who deems what is positive or negative music or positive or negative language. So here's some of the contestation that I mentioned in earlier examples. But we still need to investigate the broader story here, especially because this is more of a pseudoscience, right? So the fact of the matter is, proven or not, the idea of healing water, the idea of proclaiming the importance of energy does in fact change how we think about water, and sometimes it changes our actions too. So in South Florida, the sacred water ceremonies draw from instruction and values, as well as knowledge from various cultures and a range of earth-based belief systems in order to honor and bless the water. And thereby, they are promoting this holistic spiritual healing. And this is achieved through collective song and prayer and reflection. And so prior to the start of these events, an altar is composed of sacred materials. Sometimes these are crystals or shells or flowers or stones. They are configured in a mandala or a sacred geometrical pattern. And the pattern leads up to a large vessel. And this vessel is filled with water from whatever local body of water they are near. So sometimes it's the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes it's the Gulf, sometimes it's Lake Okeechobee. And the water is often then returned at the end of the ceremony. So participants will gather in a circular formation around the outside of this altar, and they are asked to listen to the natural world. So leaders will highlight the song of birds, or the feel of the wind, or the rush of the water. In some instances, participants are encouraged to put their hands on the ground, recognizing the connection of the self and the earth as similar living beings. And in between songs and acknowledgements of the natural world, there is this deep respect and care for the water. So water is viewed as a source of life and the lifeblood of Mother Earth. Positive vibrations and energy are often weaved throughout the ceremony as leaders explain the water as an active agent with the capacity to record, store, and transmit information. And in this sense, water is viewed as an authoritative living entity, giving it the power to impact and transform the world in which it flows. So similar to many indigenous worldviews, such animistic perspectives create a relational bond between humans and nature, uniting the two in a family-like context. In this sense, participants gravitate toward the notion that Mother Earth cares for and loves the human, plant, and animal life within her. So they are creating the sacred through ritual. And these ideas, like I had mentioned, follow indigenous and Gaia-like notions of the earth as alive, or as a mother to all humanity and all life. And with these viewpoints, it's easy to see why ceremony leaders and participants draw parallels between the water and the human body, recognizing that both the planet and humans are composed of similar percentages of water. And the ceremonies emphasize these connections, providing for meditative silence or silent prayers as participants take a moment to remember their reliance on water for every living process. So these ideas connect back to the concept of Gaia theory or Gaia hypothesis. And this was created in the 1970s by a chemist named James Lovelock and a microbiologist named Lynn Margulis. And the concept proposes that all organisms and their organic surroundings on Earth are closely integrated to form a single and self-regulating complex system, maintaining the conditions for life on the planet. And so it was named after a Greek version of Mother Nature. And though the concept of systems and flows seems new agey, and in fact, they've received a lot of criticism at first, many people have come around to this idea. And so this is where I'm going to stop sharing and show you a quick video that I have of, this came from NASA, right? And I think what's really fascinating about this is that the, first of all, the title, Watch the Earth Breathe, a visualization of seasonal vegetation and its effect on Earth. The Earth breathing suggests the Earth itself is living, right? And so again, we've got this concept of the Earth as one unit, like as Gaia, the Earth as Gaia. So this concept, it has its roots in the environmental movement. And I'm going to pause this and get back to my PowerPoint here. Here we go. Okay. 1970 was the first Earth Day, and prior to that, the first image of Earth was taken in 1968. And this iconic photo shifted our perspective. The reality of only one planet Earth came to the forefront of American thought. And to varying degrees, it acted as the impetus for environmental change. So I want us to keep this in mind as we consider these ceremonies, particularly in our climate today. So water being viewed as a family member, that, nature is guiding the participants here. And so this particular image came from a 2018 Healing Our Relationship with Water ceremony. And since then, there have been several prayer walks. 2, maybe 3 have circled Lake Okeechobee in its entire circumference. So in this regard, prayers for the water have continued. And broadly speaking, these rituals and more specifically, the emphasis of water express larger themes of connectivity. Participants view the environment as holistic, and they view humanity as one part of what constitutes this natural world. And a broader sense of community has been built around such events. So many of these participants do not just recognize the changes in the environment from a spiritual realm, but they are actively working toward a better tomorrow. So kind of what I had mentioned at the beginning of my talk, when I talked about this concept of belief and practice, and sometimes within religious studies, we think of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And so this concept of how are we taking our beliefs and putting them into practice? Well, for people who are engaged in these ceremonies, some are in active conversation with water management districts as they are pushing for more effective policies. Others have jumped into the science, undergoing training to become local water keeper rangers. And then others are grassroots organizers who are promoting clean air and water in their communities through policy changes, both on state and local levels. But regardless, these ceremonies show how people are trying to reconnect to the water, acknowledging their already existing deep connections, and ultimately revising a broader narrative. So, such efforts to bridge pre-existing divides between Floridians and water remind participants that they are one part of the natural world. This is a way of reimagining the story. They are viewing themselves as one part of the larger ecosystem, and they are seeing it as their duty to care for other members of society, including plants, animals, natural resources, and ecosystems. And these are not just limited to religious or spiritual groups. Environmentalists in other parts of the states and other parts of our state are doing the same thing. They are advocating for a change, a shift in how we are understanding our relationship with water. And what I can say is that how we look at water and talk about water is changing. And with these transformative narratives, we have the potential to challenge pre-existing stories that perpetuate water as just solely a resource to be used, and that have really helped, or that have really navigated us into more of a water crisis. So by changing our relationship, we are changing the story and laying the foundation for larger environmental change. And so Rick Kilby notes this in his book, Florida's Healing Waters. If Florida's waters are to be healed, a paradigm shift needs to occur in the very way that water is perceived. And recognizing human beings as part of the water cycle is something that we have often missed along the way. So again, this idea that water is not just a resource, but as the sacred water ceremony participants have reminded me, it is also sacred. And the moral of this story, or maybe my talk, is that we need to really collectively think about what water means to us, to you and to me, and to the millions of others who call Florida home. And we have to think about who we share this world with and who will come next. So whether it is saltwater intrusion or sea level rise or drought or red tide or cyanobacteria, given Florida's growing population and its finite resources, we are going to continue to experience strain. So considering such stories can provide a fresh outlook, and it may help the state and us to collectively grapple with these climatic pressures. So I just wanted to thank you all for your time and attention. And I'm happy to open things up and maybe have larger conversations here.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It was a very special presentation. I actually would like to start things off, if I could, with a question for you. And then I would like to invite any of our participants to put questions into chat or comments, things you'd like to have perhaps raised for discussion. The question that I would like to begin with is, with all this said, why does the concept of sacred water matter? And how can it fit into our environment? I mean, conceptually, it's fascinating, but practically, how does it fit?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really excellent question. And I think that the idea of using the sacred to create new narratives can help us lay that foundation for rethinking how we are engaging with our environment. So this is a slow, like to me, I think this is a very slow process. But it is a process that I think is necessary as we continue to consider our own beings in this world, like how we act in this world, and as we continue to consider the generations that are to come, right? Because I think that laying the foundation and getting the story right. I mean, one of the things that we talk about, or that I talk about in my classes, and from humanities-based perspectives, is the concept that words really matter, and that they can that they have an impact. And so to recognize that how we are understanding our environment around us can shape the actions that we will have. I think there's something to be said there. But again, it is sometimes a slow process. Sometimes it's slower than I want it to be. I just the other day, I was reviewing a book called Deep Water Alchemy that talked about extraction, deep water extraction. And they were talking about it not from a scientific lens, but from a humanities-based lens. And they looked at their work as critical ocean studies. And that idea kind of just blew my mind, because as a person who studies the humanities, to understand or to see that other people are understanding these spaces, not just with how are we understanding the technical side of extraction, but what are the implications of extraction when it comes to issues of justice, when it comes to social and cultural issues? Like, those are things that I'm really fascinated about. So I do think that laying the foundation and using language like the sacred might help lay that foundation.
Thank you. And do we have anyone that would like to put something into chat? And if not, I have just one other question, which this is kind of off script, but something that I do think about. Given climate change, given our recent experience with very, very strong storms, is there a concern that people in general may view water as an enemy rather than something sacred?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. I think that that's one of the double-edged sword. It's like a double-edged sword kind of thing, when it comes to nature, is that we all like to go to the beach, and we all like the idea of flocking. I mean, we continue to build on the coast because there's a reason why we continue to build on the coast, right? Like, people want to be near these spaces, but at the same time, the power of nature it's very strong, and very destructive at the same time. And so, like, this idea to just, I think there is a notion that we almost have to tread lightly and tread carefully, and to recognize that, and to recognize that we live in a very precarious space, that things are very that things can change very quickly. And that is something that we all have seen with various storms, right? Like, the storm shifts slightly, and that means that you are in its zone, right? Like, you are in the impact zone, you are in that cone, right? And that's a very scary place to be. And I think that to recognize that nature also has, like, it is dynamic, and it is not always, I don't want to say it's not always life-giving, but I think to recognize some of the downfalls of nature, or not downfalls, but just like the holistic understanding that water is not just a peaceful space, but water can be very powerful. I think that rather than maybe an enemy, to recognize the power of it, I think that would be an approach. Although, you know, if you are in that position where you have lost everything, then water does look like an enemy. You know, it does look like something that has I mean, it has taken your livelihood, it has taken your home, right? So I think that those are really tricky spaces to navigate. Um and it almost takes, again, like trying to hold both. And I think that's honestly, that's where I see the role of the humanities, to recognize that we are sometimes holding both of these things in, you know, in both hands, right? Like we are there, it is not always one or the other. One of the things I'm working on now is the concept of the sacred and the profane together. It is not just what is sacred and what is profane, but it is the fact that the everyday and the mundane and the things that we do all the time, those can be sacred too. So like holding both of those together, and it's sometimes hard to like wrap your mind around, but I think that the same can be said of water, is to hold both of these ideas, that it can be constructive, but it can also be very destructive.
It's that underlying concept of blending and balance. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending this time with us. It's been truly, truly special.